Dust devils dance across the empty street of Redemption Springs, a frontier town where hope comes to die and dreams are buried in the rust-colored earth. The afternoon sun beats down mercilessly, turning the weathered buildings into abstract shapes through waves of rising heat. A hand-painted sign creaks in the hot breeze: Thomas Ward, Cobbler and Leatherwork. The modest storefront stands between the bustling saloon and the undertaker's parlor, a fitting spot in a town where men often walk from one to the other. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the shop, Thomas Ward hunches over his workbench, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he repairs a cattleman's boot. The walls are lined with tools of his trade: awls, hammers, leather scraps, and spools of thread. Afternoon light filters through the dusty window, catching motes that dance in the air like tiny stars. Each tool hangs in its proper place, meticulously organized, a detail that might seem odd for a simple cobbler if anyone bothered to notice. The shop smells of leather, polish, and decades of honest work. At first glance, Thomas appears to be nothing more than what he claims: a man in his early 60s who spent his life mending the footwear of others. His silver hair is neatly trimmed, his clothes plain but well-maintained. Reading glasses perch on his nose as he works, and his movements are unhurried, deliberate. Only the slight bulge beneath his leather apron, where a derringer rests in a custom-made holster, hints at anything unusual. The quiet of his work is interrupted by the sound of horses outside. Too many horses for a normal afternoon in Redemption Springs. Thomas's hands pause momentarily, but he doesn't look up. Years of experience have taught him the value of appearing unaware. Through the window's reflection, he counts 6 riders dismounting, their spurs jingling with an arrogance that speaks of trouble. The Black River Gang has finally arrived. For 3 weeks, rumors have circulated about their approach. 3 banks were robbed in as many towns, leaving a trail of dead lawmen and terrified citizens. Now they've chosen Redemption Springs, likely attracted by the mining payroll due to arrive tomorrow. They're young, brutal, and convinced of their own invincibility, the most dangerous combination in the West. The gang's leader, Cole Harrison, is the first through Thomas's door. The bell above chimes softly, incongruously gentle for such a violent man. Harrison stands well over 6 feet, tall, dressed in expensive clothes that try too hard to look impressive. His gun belt is similarly ostentatious, the revolvers nickel-plated with pearl handles. Everything about him screams of someone trying to build a legend rather than earn one. "Afternoon," Thomas says mildly, not looking up from his work. His hands continue their steady rhythm, pulling thread, tapping pegs, shaping leather. Harrison's boots, far too fancy for practical use, stop in front of the workbench. "Hear you're the best cobbler between here and San Francisco," he says, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of false friendliness and underlying threat that bullies often use. Man takes pride in his reputation. "I do honest work," Thomas responds, still focused on the boot in his hands. "Nothing more, nothing less." The rest of the gang filters in, spreading out around the shop with the practiced movements of men used to intimidation. They're young, most probably in their mid-20s, all carrying similar nickel-plated revolvers. Thomas notes their positions, without appearing to look. 2 by the door, 1 examining the tools on the wall, 2 more flanking their leader. "Honest work," Harrison repeats, drawing out the words. "That's admirable. Boring as hell, but admirable." He picks up a finished boot from the counter, examining it with exaggerated care. Must get tedious, though, day after day, just sitting here, fixing other men's boots while life passes you by. The gang members snicker on cue. Thomas finally looks up, his blue eyes sharp behind his reading glasses. "Was there something specific you needed, Mr. Harrison?" "Cole Harrison." The gang leader grins, showing teeth that are too white and perfect. And what I need is some professional advice. See, my boots here. He lifts one foot, showing off the expensive leather. They're not quite right. Pinch a bit when I'm in a hurry, like, say, leaving a bank in a rush. More laughter from his men. Thomas sets aside his work carefully, marking his place with practiced precision. I see. And you'd like them adjusted? That's right, old-timer. Need to be able to move quickly in my line of work. Harrison leans forward, placing both hands on the workbench. Though I guess you wouldn't know much about moving quickly these days, would you? Bet it's been a long time since you had to run from anything. Thomas removes his reading glasses, folding them with deliberate care. The boots can be adjusted. It'll take about 3 days, cost you $5. This draws the loudest laugh yet from the gang. 3 days? Harrison straightens up, shaking his head in mock dismay. No, that won't do at all. See, we're on a tight schedule. Need them fixed by tomorrow morning. Early tomorrow morning. Quality work takes time, Thomas responds evenly. Can't be rushed. One of the gang members, a rat-faced youth with a patchy attempt at a mustache, moves closer. To the wall of tools. Sure could use some new tools, he says, reaching for an especially fine awl. Maybe we should just don't touch that. Thomas's voice hasn't changed volume, but something in his tone makes the young man freeze. For just a moment, the air in the shop seems to grow colder despite the afternoon heat. Harrison's eyes narrow slightly. Something wrong, old-timer? Awful protective of your little tools there. Every tool has its purpose, Thomas says, his weathered hands resting flat on the workbench. Best to respect that. The gang leader studies him for a long moment, then laughs again, but there's an edge to it now. You know what I think? I think you've been sitting in this shop too long, old man, making you soft in the head. He draws one of his revolvers, not pointing it directly at Thomas, but letting it rest casually on the counter. Maybe we need to help you understand how things work now. World's changed while you've been fixing boots. Thomas looks at the gun, then back to Harrison's face. His expression hasn't changed, but something shifts in his eyes, a deepening, like still water suddenly revealing its true depth. World hasn't. It changed as much as you think, Mr. Harrison. Men like you have been passing through here since before you were born. Most move on. Some don't. Is that a threat? Harrison's voice loses its false friendliness. Because I got to tell you, old-timer, threatening the Black River Gang isn't good for anyone's health. Just ask the sheriff over in Copper Creek. Oh, wait, you can't. He's dead. The other gang members shift their positions slightly, hands drifting closer to their weapons. The afternoon sun has dipped lower, casting long shadows through the shop. Windows. Thomas remains seated, his posture relaxed, but his hands no longer resting on the workbench. Not a threat, he says quietly, just an observation. Like I said, every tool has its purpose, even old ones. Harrison's face darkens. He straightens up, his revolver now pointing directly at Thomas. Last chance, old man. Fix my boots by morning, or we'll see how well you work with broken fingers. Maybe we'll even leave enough of your shop standing for you to start over, if you survive. Thomas sighs, a sound heavy with something that might be resignation or might be determination. 3 days for the boots. That's my only offer. His eyes meet Harrison's, and for the first time, the gang leader seems to notice something odd about the old cobbler's gaze. There's no fear there, no uncertainty. Instead, there's a calm assessment that seems strangely familiar. You know what? Harrison says, his voice tight with anger. I don't think we need a cobbler in Redemption Springs anymore. Boys, why don't we... The sound of horses outside interrupts him, many horses moving fast. A moment later, shouts echo from the street. Fire! Fire at the livery stable! Harrison's head turns toward the sound, and in that instant, something changes in Thomas's posture. It's subtle, a slight shift in how he holds himself, a minimal adjustment of balance. But suddenly, The old cobbler seems to occupy his space differently, as if he's been wearing a coat that's now slipping off. "Better go check on your horses," he says softly. "Livery stable's where you left them, isn't it?" Harrison's eyes snap back. To Thomas, narrowing with suspicion, "This isn't over, old man." He gestures to his men, and they file out quickly, boots thundering on the wooden floor. The gang leader backs toward the door, his gun still pointed at Thomas. "We'll finish this conversation later." "Looking forward to it," Thomas responds, already reaching for his glasses and the unfinished boot. As Harrison leaves, the old cobbler allows himself a small smile. He knows exactly how many hours it will take the gang to verify their horses are safe, to check the livery stable, to realize there was no fire at all. Just enough time for what needs to be done. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas stands. He moves to the door and turns the sign to closed. Then he walks to the back of his shop, to a locked trunk that hasn't been opened in 15 years. Inside is another set of tools, ones that have nothing to do with fixing boots, but everything to do with fixing other kinds of problems. It's time to remind the Black River Gang that some legends don't fade away. They just find different ways to keep the peace. As the sun begins to set over Redemption Springs, Thomas Ward removes his cobbler's apron. Beneath it, his clothes are plain but practical, worn in ways that suggest they're designed for quick movement. The Derringer in its custom holster is joined by something else, a gun belt that's been carefully maintained despite years of disuse. The revolvers it holds are simple, blued steel without any fancy decorations, working guns for a working man. Just like his cobbler's tools, every piece has its purpose. And tomorrow he'll demonstrate why he earned the name Quick Stitch Thomas. Not for his skill with leather and thread, but for how fast he could put men in the ground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The setting sun paints Redemption Springs in shades of amber and shadow as Thomas begins his preparations. In the back room of his shop, past the racks of leather and supplies, he pulls out a worn leather journal from beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages contain more than just accounts of shoe repairs and orders. They hold careful observations of the town's rhythms, its weaknesses, and its defensive positions. Across the street, the saloon comes alive with the sound of revelry. The Black River Gang has returned from their wild goose chase at the livery stable, and now they're celebrating their imagined victory over the old cobbler. Their laughter carries through the evening air, along with the sound of breaking glass and frightened piano music. Thomas makes his way upstairs to his modest living quarters above the shop. The room is sparse but meticulously organized. A single bed, a washing stand, and a wooden chest that hasn't seen use in years. He unlocks the chest with a key kept on a chain around his neck. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, lies a gunfighter's legacy. The first item he removes is a newspaper clipping, yellow with age. The headline reads, "Quick Stitch Thomas brings down the Vasquez brothers." The image shows a younger man with the same sharp eyes, standing over 3 bound outlaws. That was 20 years ago, back when his reputation was enough to make most troublemakers turn their horses around at the mere mention of his name. Next comes a marshal's badge, its silver surface dulled by time, but still carrying the weight of authority. He'd turned it in officially, but kept it as a reminder of the oath he'd taken, an oath that didn't end just because he'd changed professions. As he checks his revolvers with practiced efficiency, Thomas reflects on the changes 15 years of peace have brought to Redemption Springs. The town had been wild once, but under his quiet watch it had grown into something respectable. Families had put down roots, Businesses had flourished, all because good people believed they were safe here. The Black River Gang threatens all of that, not just with their planned robbery, but with the message their success would send. That redemption. Springs is easy prey. Thomas knows from experience that in the West, reputation is everything. Once a town loses its reputation for safety, the predators never stop coming. From his window, he can see Harrison and his men stumbling from the saloon to the hotel across the way. They're loud, drunk on both whiskey and their own sense of invulnerability. They've already forgotten about the old cobbler who dared to stand up to them, dismissing him as just another tired old man trying to cling to his dignity. Tomorrow, they'll remember. Tomorrow, they'll learn why the old-timers in these parts still speak in whispers about Quick-Stitch Thomas, the man so fast with a gun that folks said he could put a bullet in you before you realized he'd moved. The man who earned his nickname, not just for his speed, but for how many outlaws ended up needing stitches or an undertaker. But for now, Thomas returns to his workbench. There's still a cattleman's boot that needs mending, and he's never been one to leave a job unfinished. His hands move with the same precise care they always have, whether crafting, leather, or handling firearms. In both cases, it's about attention to detail, about understanding that small mistakes can have fatal consequences. As night settles over Redemption Springs, Thomas Ward continues his work by lamplight. To anyone passing by, he's just a dedicated cobbler staying late to finish a repair. They don't notice how his practiced movements mirror the maintenance of a gun, how his careful stitches follow the same patterns as the scars he's left on those who once threatened the peace. Tomorrow, the Black River Gang will learn what the old-timers already know, that some men retire from violence not because they've grown weak, but because they've grown wise. And that wisdom, combined with skill that never truly fades, makes them the most dangerous men of all. Dawn breaks over Redemption Springs with the gentle persistence of a well-worn routine. Thomas Ward opens his shop precisely at 7, just as he has every morning for the past 15 years. The town's early risers, already familiar with his habits, begin to arrive with their various needs: a broken heel, a torn sole, a strap in need of mending. Martha Chen from the laundry brings, in her son's school boots, their toes worn through from too much play. "I swear, Mr. Ward, that boy goes through shoes faster than he grows out of them," she says, placing them on the counter. Thomas examines the boots with professional care, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Growing boys are hard on leather, Mrs. Chen. No charge for these. Consider it my investment in young Timothy's education." "You're too kind," Martha protests. But Thomas is already working, his skilled hands beginning the repair with practiced ease. She leaves a fresh mooncake on his counter anyway, wrapped in brown paper. The morning progresses with its usual parade of customers. Farmers with mud-caked boots, ranch hands with worn stirrup leathers, ladies needing delicate repairs to their walking shoes. Each one receives the same careful attention, the same quiet competence that has made Thomas Ward a respected fixture in Redemption Springs. To most, he's simply the town cobbler, a craftsman whose skill with leather is matched only by his unfailing courtesy. They see his silver hair and weathered hands, note his careful movements and soft-spoken manner, and think they know him completely. Even his occasional acts of kindness, like fixing young Timothy's boots for free, seem perfectly in character for a gentle old tradesman. Few notice how he positions himself to keep both the door and windows in view while he works. None recognize that his seemingly random questions about their days, their travels, their observations are actually carefully cataloguing the movement of people and information through Redemption Springs. Sheriff Mills stops by mid-morning, ostensibly to pick up his repaired gun belt. The leatherwork is flawless, every stitch placed with precision. "Fine work as always, Thomas," he says, running a finger along the strengthened holster. "Just a matter of understanding the materials," Thomas responds mildly. Then, almost casually, "Noticed some new faces in town. The ones over at Carter's Hotel seem particularly interested in the bank." Mills tenses slightly. He's young for a sheriff, barely 35, but smart enough to recognize a warning when he hears one. "The Black River Gang. Got a wire about them yesterday. They've hit 3 banks in the territory already." "4, Thomas corrects gently, adjusting his glasses. "Word in Copper Creek is that they robbed the Cattleman's Trust 2 days ago. 8 dead, including the sheriff." The young lawman's hand strays to his gun, a nervous gesture he probably doesn't even notice. "Wasn't in the wire. How did you—" People talk while their boots are being mended. Amazing what you learn. Just listen. Thomas begins work on another piece, his awl moving with steady precision. "Mining payroll's due tomorrow, isn't it?" "Yeah." Mills runs a hand through his hair, suddenly looking very young indeed. "Already sent deputies to escort the wagon. But if the Black River Gang is really here, best post extra watches tonight," Thomas suggests, not looking up from his work. "Particularly around the livery stable. Gangs that size, they'll need fresh horses for a quick getaway." The sheriff nods slowly, studying the old cobbler with newfound curiosity. Something about the way Thomas speaks, the quiet authority in his voice, the specific nature of his suggestions, seems at odds with his simple tradesman's appearance. Before Mills can pursue this thought, the shop's door chimes. Cole Harrison swaggers in, still wearing the same boots he'd demanded be fixed the day before. His eyes narrow at the sight of the sheriff, but his smile remains fixed in place. "Well, if it isn't our local law enforcement," Harrison drawls. "Don't. Suppose you're here about the fire someone falsely reported at the livery stable yesterday. Caused quite a commotion, almost like someone was trying to waste our time." Mills straightens, his hand again straying toward his gun. "No reports were filed, but if you'd like to make one—" "Not necessary." Harrison's smile doesn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding. Like the misunderstanding our friend Thomas here seems to have about how quickly he can fix my boots." Thomas continues his work, seemingly absorbed in the leather before him. "As I said yesterday, quality work takes time. Still 3 days for a proper repair." "And as I said yesterday," Harrison's voice hardens, "that timeline doesn't work for me. But I've had time to think about our conversation, and I've come up with a solution." He reaches into his coat and produces a stack of bills. $500. That should convince you to adjust your schedule, shouldn't it? The sheriff tenses, but Thomas merely sets down his tools with deliberate care. "Money doesn't change the time leather needs to cure, Mr. Harrison, or the attention each stitch requires. Some things can't be rushed no matter how much you pay." Harrison's face darkens. He slaps the money down on the workbench, sending leather scraps scattering. "Listen here, old man. I've been patient. More patient than my reputation usually allows. But you're starting to make me think you're either stupid or looking for trouble." "Just honest," Thomas responds quietly, beginning to gather the scattered materials about my work and what it requires. "Honest?" Harrison laughs, but there's no humor in it. "Let me be honest then. By this time tomorrow, things in this town are going to change. The only question is whether you'll be around to see it." He leans forward, dropping his voice. "One last chance. Fix my boots by morning or what?" Sheriff Mills interrupts, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "You making threats, mister?" Harrison straightens slowly, his smile returning. "Just having a business discussion with our local craftsman. Nothing that concerns the law." He tips his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Good day, Sheriff." Thomas. As he leaves, he knocks a pair of finished boots off the counter. They hit the floor with a dull thud, leather and nails scattering across wooden planks. Mills moves to help clean up, but Thomas waves him away. "Best see those extra watches, Sheriff, especially around the livery stable." The young lawman hesitates. "You sure you're all right here, Thomas? I could post as a deputy." "I've managed this long," Thomas says, already beginning to restore order to his workbench. Each tool returns to its proper place, each piece of leather carefully sorted. Though you might want to send a wire to Marshal Hanson in Cedar Ridge, let him know about that Copper Creek robbery. Mills nods slowly, that look of curiosity returning to his face. But Thomas has already returned to his work, his attention seemingly consumed by the leather in his hands. The sheriff leaves, boot heels clicking on wooden planks, while Thomas continues his careful restoration of order. To anyone watching through the shop window, the old cobbler appears completely unaffected by Harrison's threats. They see only a craftsman absorbed in his trade, methodically going about his business as the morning sun climbs higher over Redemption Springs. They don't see how each tool he replaces could serve another purpose in skilled hands. They don't notice that the leather knife he tests for sharpness is balanced perfectly for throwing, or that the hammer he sets aside could crack a skull as easily as it drives nails. Most importantly, they don't realize that every movement, every careful placement, is preparation for what's coming. Because Thomas Ward has learned that the best way to handle trouble isn't to meet it head-on, but to be ready when it arrives. Like leather curing in his workshop, some things can't be rushed. They require patience, attention to detail, and the wisdom to know exactly when they're ready. The afternoon heat lies heavy over Redemption Springs as a lone rider approaches from the east, his horse kicking up dust along the sun-baked road. Even at a distance, there's something wrong about the way he sits in the saddle, a stiffness that speaks of injury. By the time he reaches the edge of town, his shirt is dark with blood. The rider manages to stay mounted until he reaches the sheriff's office, then slumps forward across his horse's neck. "Deputy Marshal Collins," he gasps, as Sheriff Mills and his men rush to help him down. "Black River Gang, they knew we were coming." Inside his shop, Thomas Ward hears the commotion. He sets aside the boot he's working on and moves to his window, staying carefully out of sight as he observes the scene unfolding across the street. The wounded man is Wesley Collins. He recognizes him from his days as a marshal, though the young deputy probably wouldn't remember the quiet cobbler. Through the open window, fragments of conversation reach him. "Ambushed, mining payroll, all dead." The deputy's voice is weak, fading. "They're coming, warned them." "But they knew." Thomas's hands tighten imperceptibly on the window. Ephraim, the mining payroll escort, the one Sheriff Mills sent for this morning, must have met the Black River Gang on the road, but something about this doesn't fit. The gang couldn't have known about the escort unless the shop's door chimes. Hope. "I'm not interrupting." The voice belongs to Daniel Carter, owner of the hotel where the Black River Gang is staying. He's dressed in his usual fine clothes, every inch the successful businessman, but there's something different about his manner today. Something predatory. "Just a closing for lunch," Thomas responds, turning slowly from the window. He notes Carter's position, the way he's standing just inside the door, one hand resting casually near his coat pocket. "This won't take long." Carter produces an envelope thick with papers. "Found something interesting in an old newspaper archive. Been doing some reading about the famous Quick-Stitch Thomas." The name hangs in the air between them. Thomas doesn't react, his face remaining impassive as he begins cleaning his work tools. "Sounds like a dime novel character." "That's what I thought at first." Carter moves further into the shop, closing the door behind him. The bell chimes again, softer this time, like a warning. "But the more I read, the more interesting it got. Did you know Quick-Stitch Thomas disappeared 15 years ago? Right around the same time, a quiet cobbler set up shop in Redemption Springs. Lots of men came west 15 years ago," Thomas says mildly, continuing to clean his tools. "Lots. Of cobblers, too." Carter's smile doesn't reach his eyes. "True. But how many of them have gun calluses under their cobbler's calluses? How many know exactly how to maintain a lawman's gun belt? How many send subtle warnings to sheriffs about gang movements?" He drops the envelope on the workbench. "Newspaper. Clippings spill out, yellowed pages telling stories of a legendary lawman who could draw and fire faster than any man in the territory. The photographs are old, faded, but the resemblance is unmistakable. "You've done your research," Thomas acknowledges. "Not touching the clippings. Must have taken time." 3 months. Carter's pretense at friendliness drops away. "Ever since I started working with the Black River Gang, had to make sure Redemption Springs was safe for their operation, had to know if there were any complications, and there it is. The piece that didn't fit slides into place. Carter's hotel, perfectly positioned near the bank. His sudden interest in old newspapers. The gang knows about the payroll escort. "You're their inside man," Thomas says quietly. "Smart as they say you were." Carter draws a derringer from his coat pocket, a small gun, easily concealed. "Harrison doesn't know who you are yet. None of them do. I could have told them, but I wanted to handle this myself. Make my reputation by taking down the legendary Quick-Stitch Thomas." Thomas doesn't move from his workbench. His hands remain steady as he continues cleaning his tools. "That's quite a plan, Mr. Carter, but you've made 3 mistakes." "Really?" Carter's laugh is confident, dismissive. "And what would those be?" "First," Thomas sets down the leather knife he's been cleaning, "you assumed I was trying to hide who I was. I wasn't, just waiting for the right moment." Second, his hand moves to the next tool, a heavy cobbler's hammer. "You thought a derringer would be enough. It's not." Carter's finger tightens on the trigger. "And the third mistake, you close the door. The movement is almost too fast to follow." Thomas's hand flicks forward, the hammer spinning through the air, even as Carter fires. The derringer's shot goes wide as the hammer strikes his wrist, sending the small gun clattering to the floor. Before Carter can recover, Thomas vaults over the workbench with a speed that belies his age, closing the distance between them in 2 fluid steps. Carter reaches for a hidden revolver, but he never makes it. Thomas's first strike targets his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. The second, a precise blow to the side of his neck, sends him stumbling backward. The third puts him on the floor, gasping and disarmed. "Now then," Thomas says, his voice still calm as he retrieves both of Carter's weapons, "let's discuss the rest of your plan for the mining payroll." "You'll kill me?" Carter manages between breaths. "No." Thomas pulls a length of leather cord from his workbench. "Despite what the papers said, I never killed unless I had to. But you're going to tell me everything about Harrison's plan, every detail, because if you don't..." He moves closer, and something in his eyes makes Carter press himself against the wall. "If you don't, I'll start demonstrating why they really called me Quick-Stitch. It wasn't just about gun speed, you see. It was about how fast I could put a man back together after questioning him. And I'm very, very good with a needle." Outside, the commotion around the wounded deputy marshal continues. No one notices the brief sounds of struggle from the cobbler's shop. No one sees Carter's face go pale as Thomas begins his questioning, each inquiry punctuated by the slow, deliberate testing of a curved leather needle. 20 minutes later, Thomas has everything he needs. Carter lies bound and gagged in the shop's back room, secured with the same precision the old cobbler brings to all his work. The hotel owner had broken quickly, revealing not just the gang's plans for tomorrow's robbery, but their entire operation, including their connection to a larger network of outlaws operating throughout the territory. Thomas returns to his workbench, considering his next move. The wounded deputy marshal's arrival changes things. Harrison will know his payroll escort ambush was successful and will think his path to the bank is clear. But he won't know that his inside man has been compromised, that his carefully laid plans are now in the hands of the one man capable of stopping them. Moving with methodical purpose, Thomas begins preparing for what's to come. He lays out his Tools, both kinds with practiced precision. Each piece has its place, each movement measured and sure. To anyone passing by the shop window, he's just a cobbler readying his work for the next day. They don't see him testing the balance of knives that never touched leather or checking the action of guns that haven't been fired in 15 years. They don't notice how he positions certain tools within easy reach, or the way he rearranges his shop to create clear lines of fire, because Thomas Ward understands that preparation is everything, whether you're crafting fine boots or preparing to face down a gang of killers. And tomorrow, when Harrison and his men make their move, they'll learn that some skills never fade. They just find different ways to express themselves. The sun begins its descent toward evening, painting Redemption Springs in shades of amber and shadow. In his shop, Thomas Ward makes his final preparations. Tomorrow will bring violence back to his quiet life, will force him to become again the man he left behind 15 years ago. But this time, it will be on his terms, in his territory, using all the patience and cunning that 15 years of peace have taught him. Because sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the one that charges forward, but the one that waits, watches, and chooses the perfect moment to strike. As dusk approaches, Thomas begins implementing the first phase of his plan. He starts with Carter's confession, carefully transcribing every detail into his journal. Names, dates, locations, a complete map of the Black River Gang's operations and their broader network of criminals. This information isn't just about tomorrow's attempted robbery. It's evidence that could dismantle criminal operations across 3 territories. The sound of boots on his shop's wooden porch interrupts his writing. Sheriff Mills enters, his young face creased with worry. Thomas, Deputy Marshal Collins. He didn't make it. Died about an hour ago. Thomas sets down his pen carefully. Did he say anything else before? Just that they knew. Somehow the gang knew exactly where to set their ambush. Mills runs a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I've got men watching the bank, but with the payroll arriving tomorrow, how many deputies do you have left? 4. 2 watching the bank, 2 patrolling the streets. Mills looks around the shop, his eyes lingering on the carefully arranged tools. I sent wires to every town within riding distance, but even if help comes, it won't be in time, Thomas finishes. He rises from his workbench, moving to a shelf of finished work. Sheriff, I need you to do something for me, but I can't explain why, not yet. Mills watches as Thomas selects a gun belt, the same one he'd repaired that morning. What do you need? At midnight, have your men pull back from the bank. All of them. Make it obvious. I want the gang to see them leave. That's crazy. The payroll will be safer than you think. Thomas hands him the gun belt. Trust me, sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to make it look like there isn't one. The sheriff studies the repaired leather, then looks at Thomas with new understanding. You know something about the gang, about tomorrow. Yes. Are you going to tell me what? Thomas considers his answer carefully. Right now, what you don't know keeps you safer. Just have your men clear out at midnight. And the sheriff, stay away from Carter's hotel tomorrow, no matter what you hear. Mills opens his mouth to argue, then stops. Something in Thomas's manner, the quiet authority, the precise way he gives instructions, makes him reconsider. All right, midnight. But Thomas, if you're planning something, I'm just a cobbler, Sheriff, one who believes in being prepared. After Mills leaves, Thomas returns to his preparations. From a hidden compartment beneath his workbench, he retrieves several small packages wrapped in waxed paper. Inside each is a carefully measured amount of black powder, not enough to kill, but more than sufficient to create confusion and cover. He places these strategic points around his shop, under loose floorboards, behind shelves, in places where they'll serve his purpose tomorrow. Each location is chosen with the same precision he brings to his leatherwork, creating a carefully orchestrated sequence of diversions and escape routes. As full dark settles over Redemption Springs, Thomas hears the celebrations begin at the saloon. The Black River Gang, confident in their victory over the payroll escort, are drinking to their success. Their laughter carries through the night air, along with snatches of boasting about tomorrow's plans. They don't know that their inside man is bound and gagged in Thomas's backroom. They don't know that their carefully planned ambush points have been compromised. Most importantly, they don't know that when they make their move tomorrow, they'll be walking into a trap 15 years in the making. In his shop, Thomas continues his work by lamplight. Each motion is measured, each preparation tested and verified. He's not just preparing for a fight, he's orchestrating a performance, one where every move, every reaction has been calculated in advance. The guns he cleaned earlier are now loaded with specialized rounds, some with reduced powder charges for close work, others with custom loads designed for specific purposes. Each is placed precisely where he'll need it when the time comes. Near midnight, he hears the sheriff's men making their conspicuous withdrawal from the bank. Through his window, he sees members of the Black River Gang watching from the shadows, just as he'd anticipated. They'll report back to Harrison, tell him the way is clear. The trap is baited. Thomas allows himself a small smile as he makes his final adjustments. Tomorrow, the Black River Gang will learn what old-timers in the territory already know, that some men don't age, they season, like fine leather, becoming more dangerous with each passing year. The lamp burns low as Thomas Ward, once known as the quickest gun in the West, prepares for one last dance with violence, but this time he's not just fighting to stop a robbery or save a town. He's fighting to protect 15 years of peace, 15 years of watching children grow up without fear, 15 years of helping build something worth defending. And if the Black River Gang thinks an old cobbler will be easy prey, they're about to learn that some legends don't fade away. They just find different ways to settle accounts. A cold wind sweeps through Redemption Springs in the hours before dawn, rattling shop signs and stirring dust along empty streets. In the growing light, a solitary figure moves with purpose between shadows. Rebecca Chen, Martha's 16-year-old daughter, making her way to the bakery where she works. She's taken this route every morning for the past year, without incident. Today is different. Two members of the Black River Gang emerge from an alley ahead of her. They're drunk, belligerent, looking for amusement in the pre-dawn hours. Rebecca freezes, then turns to retreat, only to find a third man blocking her path. "Well, what do we have here?" The gang member grins, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Little early for a lady to be out alone, isn't it?" Rebecca's heart pounds as they close in. She opens her mouth to scream, but before she can draw breath, another sound cuts through the morning air, the sharp crack of wood against stone, like a walking stick striking the ground. "Miss Chen." Thomas Ward's voice carries clearly from the shadows. "I believe you dropped this yesterday." He steps into view, moving with the unhurried grace of an old man going about his morning routine. In his hands is a simple wooden box, the kind used for delivering repaired shoes. The gang members tense at his appearance, but then relax, seeing only a harmless cobbler. "Move along, old-timer," the one with tobacco-stained teeth growls. "This ain't your business." Thomas continues his steady approach, his manner unchanged. "Actually, it is. You see, I promised Mrs. Chen I'd look after her daughter's welfare. Professional courtesy, you understand? She's one of my most reliable customers." He reaches Rebecca's side, placing himself between her and the men with such subtle precision that they don't immediately realize he's maneuvered them into awkward positions, forcing them to cluster together if they want to maintain their threatening stance. Last. "Warning!" the lead gang member says, drawing a knife. "Walk away," or the change in Thomas happens between one heartbeat and the next. There's no dramatic transformation, no obvious shift in his posture. But suddenly, the morning air feels different. charged with something the gang members can't quite identify, but instinctively fear. "That's a Mexican trimming knife," Thomas observes mildly, nodding at the blade. "Good steel, poor balance, designed for detailed work, not fighting." His eyes, previously soft with age, have taken on a different quality, like the sun glinting. "Off frozen water. You're holding it wrong," the gang member blinks, his confidence wavering. "What? If you're going to threaten someone with a knife," Thomas continues, in the same conversational tone he uses to discuss leather grades, "you should understand its purpose. That blade was meant for careful, precise work, much like this." His movement is too fast to follow. The shoebox in his hands becomes a blur, and suddenly the knife is spinning through the air. Before anyone can react, Thomas catches it by the handle, reverse grip, the blade now perfectly positioned for close work. "See?" he says softly. "Balance matters." The gang members stare, their alcohol-addled minds struggling to process what they've just witnessed. The casual display of skill, the implicit threat in his stance, the way he seems to occupy more space than his physical form should allow. It all adds up to something that sets off ancient warning signals in their primitive brains. "Miss Chen," Thomas says, not taking his eyes off the men. "The bakery's waiting." Rebecca doesn't need to be told twice. She hurries past the gang members, who make no move to stop her. They're too focused on Thomas, on the way he's examining their knife with professional interest. "Nice piece," he says finally. "Spanish steel, probably stolen from a real craftsman. Shame to see it misused." He flips it in his hand, offering it back handle first. "Word of advice? Find a different line of work. This one requires skills you don't have." The lead gang member snatches the knife back, trying to hide his trembling hands. "You've made a mistake, old man." "When Harrison hears about this, tell him whatever you like," Thomas interrupts. "But remember, I work with leather every day. I know how easily it can be marked, scarred, ruined beyond repair." His smile doesn't reach his eyes. "Just like skin." They back away, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Only when they're nearly out of sight does one of them find the courage to speak. "This ain't over." "No," Thomas agrees quietly. "It isn't." He watches them disappear around a corner, then begins walking toward his shop. His movements are once again those of an elderly craftsman, but now an observer might notice other details. How he keeps to the shadows out of habit, how his steps fall silently despite his apparent age, how his eyes constantly scan his surroundings. Inside his shop, Thomas finds Rebecca's mother waiting. Martha Chen's face is pale, but her voice is steady. "Rebecca told me what happened. Those men won't be bothering her again," Thomas assures her, moving to his workbench. "The way you moved," Martha says slowly. "I've never seen anything like it, except—" She pauses, studying him with new eyes. "Except once. Years ago, when I was a girl in San Francisco. There was a lawman there, famous for how fast he could draw. They called him—" "It was a long time ago," Thomas interrupts gently. "Another life." Martha nods, understanding. "Will there be trouble? With the gang?" Some things can't be avoided. Thomas begins laying out his tools for the day's work, each placement precise and purposeful. But trouble has a way of finding its own level, like water seeking the lowest point. She watches him work for a moment, noting how his supposedly arthritic hands move with fluid grace when he thinks no one's paying attention. "The mining payroll arrives today," she says finally. "People are saying the Black River Gang means to take it. People say a lot of things. They also say—" Martha hesitates. "They say you're not just a cobbler, that you have other skills this town might need." Thomas looks up from his work, meeting her eyes. "What do you think, Mrs. Chen?" He straightens her spine. "I think my daughter walked safely past 3 dangerous men this morning because you were there. I think this town has been peaceful for 15 years because you chose to make your home here. And I think perhaps it's time for more than just mending shoes. A ghost of a smile touches Thomas's lips. Perhaps you're right. He returns to his work, but his movements have changed subtly, becoming more deliberate, more focused. You might want to keep Rebecca home today. In fact, it might be best if your family stayed inside until tomorrow. Martha moves to the door, then pauses. Thomas, thank you for everything. After she leaves, Thomas continues his preparations. The encounter with the gang members this morning wasn't random. They were testing him, trying to gauge his capabilities. Harrison would have ordered it, suspicious after yesterday's events. They'd learned something, but not everything. Not yet. Thomas allows himself a grim smile as he checks the hidden compartments in his shop, each one containing tools that have nothing to do with leatherwork. The gang thought they were being clever, probing his defenses, but they didn't realize they were revealing their own weaknesses. The morning sun climbs higher, painting Redemption Springs in shades of promise and threat. In his shop, Thomas Ward continues his work, each stitch and cut precise, each movement measured. To anyone watching, he's just a skilled craftsman practicing his trade. They don't see how each piece of leather he cuts becomes a lesson in anatomy, how each hammer blow could translate to combat, and how each careful measurement maps out angles of attack and defense. They don't notice that while his hands work with leather and thread, his mind is choreographing a dance of violence that will begin when the Black River Gang makes their move. Because some men don't just master one craft, they learn to see how all skills connect, how the patience needed to work, leather translates to the patience needed to spring a trap, and how the precision required for fine stitching applies equally to the art of combat. The bell above his shop door chimes as the first regular customers of the day begin to arrive. Thomas greets them with his usual quiet courtesy, but his mind is already moving ahead, plotting out the steps of a confrontation that will remind the territory why they once whispered his name in fear and awe. The Black River Gang thought they were clever, testing an old cobbler's defenses. Soon they'll learn that some tests reveal more about the examiner than the examined. By mid-morning, word of the encounter had spread through Redemption Springs. Like wildfire. The town's residents begin looking at Thomas Ward differently, noticing details they'd overlooked for 15 years. The way he always positions himself with clear sightlines to doors and windows, how his seemingly random questions about their daily lives actually map out patterns of movement through the town. The precise, efficient way he handles tools that could serve more lethal purposes than leatherwork. Sarah Miller, the telegraph operator's widow, brings in a pair of boots that don't really need repair. As Thomas examines them, she leans close and whispers, "Riders coming in from the north." 4 men, heavily armed. Charlie saw them from the telegraph office. Thomas nods, almost imperceptibly, continuing his inspection of the boots. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Best take the children on that visit to your sister you were mentioning." She understands immediately. "We'll leave within the hour." "But Thomas, what you did for Rebecca Chen this morning, people are talking, they're saying—" "People say many things," he interrupts gently. "Best not to listen too closely." But Sarah persists. "They're saying you're him, Quick-Stitch Thomas, the man who cleaned out the Carson gang single-handed. The fastest gun in 3 territories. Thomas sets the boots aside carefully. "Those stories are from another time, Mrs. Miller. Best left there." "Maybe." She studies him with shrewd eyes. "Or maybe some stories need to be remembered, especially now." After she leaves, Thomas moves to his window, watching the street with careful attention. He spots the new riders easily. They're trying too hard to look casual, their gun belts too well-oiled, their clothes too new. More of Harrison's men, brought in to reinforce the gang for tomorrow's robbery. But there's something else catching his attention. Small details that most would miss. The way Mr. Peterson at the general store is turning away certain customers. The subtle signals passing between townspeople, the quiet movement of families toward the outskirts of town. Redemption Springs is preparing for trouble in its own way. Judge Wilson enters the shop next, ostensibly to discuss repairs to his courtroom bench. The elderly jurist has served Redemption Springs for 20 years, and his eyes hold a wealth of understanding as he regards Thomas. Interesting thing about leather, the judge says, running his hand along the workbench. Properly treated, it never really loses its essential nature. You can shape it, work it, try to make it something else, but in times of stress, it always remembers what it truly is. Thomas continues his work, but his lips quirk slightly. Speaking metaphorically, Your Honor. Perhaps. Wilson's voice drops lower. I remember the day you rode into town 15 years ago. Recognized you immediately, though I never said anything. Figured a man had his reasons for seeking a quieter life. And now? Now I'm wondering if that quiet life was just another form of service. Watching, waiting, protecting in a different way. The judge straightens his vest. The telegram about Deputy Marshal Collins's death went out an hour ago. By tomorrow, every lawman in the territory will know the Black River Gang murdered a federal officer. Thomas nods slowly. That changes things. Indeed, turns a simple bank robbery into a federal matter. Means whatever happens here tomorrow will have official sanction, regardless of methods used. The implications are clear. The judge is offering cover, ensuring that whatever action Thomas takes will be viewed as legitimate law enforcement rather than vigilante justice. Appreciate the consideration, Your Honor, Thomas says quietly. Wilson moves to the door, then pauses. You know, I was in Cedar Ridge that day, 15 years ago when you faced down the Carson brothers. Never seen anything like it. 3 men, drawing on you, and before anyone could blink, he shakes his head in remembered awe. The stories don't do it justice. Stories rarely do. No, I suppose not. The judge's eyes are keen, but sometimes they serve a purpose. Sometimes they remind us that justice wears many faces. He gestures to Thomas's workbench, to the tools laid out with such precise care. A craftsman understands that different jobs require different tools. Justice is no different. After Wilson leaves, Thomas returns to his work, but his movements have taken on a new quality. Each stitch, each cut, each hammer blow serves dual purpose now, maintaining his cover while preparing for what's to come. He can feel the weight of the town's expectations settling around him like a familiar coat, one he'd hung up 15 years ago but never truly put away. The sound of horses outside draws his attention again. More riders arriving, these ones not, bothering to hide their nature. The Black River Gang is consolidating its forces, preparing for tomorrow's raid. They don't realize they're actually gathering for their own reckoning, because Quick-Stitch Thomas hadn't retired out of fear or fatigue. He'd stepped away because he'd grown tired of the killing, of being nothing more than a weapon. He'd chosen a craftsman's life to learn patience, precision, the satisfaction of creating rather than destroying. But now, as he watches Harrison's men swaggering through his town, threatening his people, Thomas realizes that sometimes the greatest act of creation is the restoration of justice. And tomorrow, the Black River Gang will learn that 15 years of peaceful work haven't dulled his skills. They've honed them to a razor's edge. The afternoon sun hangs like a molten coin in the sky when the first shot rings out. It comes from the direction of the livery stable, followed by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Thomas Ward looks up from his workbench, his hands pausing mid-stitch as he counts the seconds between sounds, mapping the conflict in his mind. 3 more. Shots in quick succession. Running feet on wooden sidewalks. A woman's scream cut short. The bell above his shop door chimes violently as Sheriff Mills bursts in, blood streaming from a gash above his eye. "They've gone crazy," he gasps, stumbling against the counter. "Just started shooting. No warning." Thomas is already moving, guiding the young lawman to a chair while retrieving a medical kit from beneath his workbench. "How many?" "Started with 2. By the stable. Mills winces as Thomas begins cleaning his wound. Accused Jake Turner's boy of spying on them. Shot him dead right there in the street. When I tried to intervene, he gestures to his head. The other shots? My deputies tried to restore order. Harrison's men were waiting for them, like they wanted this to happen. Mills grabs Thomas's arm. They've taken the bank, got hostages inside. Thomas's hands remain steady as he places a neat row of stitches across the sheriff's wound. The medical kit, like everything else in his shop, serves multiple purposes. How many hostages? 6, maybe 7, including Mary Turner, Jake's widow. She was trying to get to her boy's body when they grabbed her. Mills studies Thomas's face. You know what this means, don't you? They're not waiting for tomorrow. This isn't about a payroll anymore. No. Thomas ties off the last stitch with surgical precision. It's about sending a message, showing the town what happens when someone stands up to them. He moves to his window, staying carefully out of sight as he surveys the street. The Black River Gang has positioned men strategically, 2 on the hotel roof, 3 covering the bank's entrance, others patrolling the spaces between buildings. Professional work, suggesting this isn't their first takeover of a town. Harrison's. Changing the game, Thomas says quietly, making it personal, because of what happened to Rebecca Chen this morning. Mills asks, or because they figured out who you are? Both. Neither. Thomas continues his assessment of the gang's positions. They're scared. Fear makes men do stupid things, like killing an innocent boy to prove they're not afraid. A voice booms from outside, amplified by the street's acoustics. Cole Harrison stands in front of the bank, his nickel-plated guns gleaming. Thomas Ward, I know you can hear me, old man. We had a real conversation about respect. Thomas doesn't respond, continuing his preparations with methodical care. No, and sir, maybe this will get your attention. Harrison's voice carries a cruel edge. Mrs. Turner, step forward, please. Mary Turner's sob carries clearly through the afternoon air. See, I've been doing some thinking, Harrison continues. About reputations, about legends, about how a man like Quick Stitch Thomas could just disappear for 15 years, hiding in plain sight, letting people think he was nothing but a simple cobbler. The street falls deadly silent. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Oh yes, we know who you are now. Carter might have disappeared, but he left some interesting reading material behind. The famous lawman who could draw faster than thought, who brought in the Carson gang single-handed. Now, nothing but a tired old man, mending boots. Thomas's hands move with practiced efficiency as he checks his weapons, each motion precise and purposeful. So here's how this plays out, Harrison announces. You got 1 hour to surrender yourself, walk out into the street, unarmed, and face justice for all the men you killed back in the day. Do that, and these fine folks in the bank get to live. Refuse. A single gunshot punctuates his threat. Mary Turner screams again, this time in pain. That was just her arm, Harrison calls out. Next one goes somewhere more vital. Their blood's on your hands, legend, just like all the others. Sheriff. Mills starts to rise, but Thomas stops him with a gentle hand. They'll kill you the moment you show yourself. We can't just let them... No. Thomas's voice carries an edge of steel. We can't. He moves to the back of his shop, to the locked trunk that contains his past. But this time, he doesn't open. Instead, he slides it aside, revealing a trapdoor underneath. The wood is worn smooth from years of careful maintenance, the hinges oiled to perfect silence. The old tunnels, Mills breathes, from the silver mining days, but they collapsed decades ago. Some did. Thomas lifts the trapdoor, revealing a carefully maintained passage. Others were just sealed off, by people who understood the value of having options. He retrieves several small packages from his workbench, the same ones he'd prepared the night before. These tunnels run under the entire town, including the bank. Understanding dawns in Mills's eyes. You've been maintaining them all these years, planning for something like this, planning for possibilities. Thomas checks his pocket watch. 56 minutes until Harrison's deadline. More than enough time. For what? Thomas's smile is cold as winter steel. To remind the Black River Gang why they used to tell stories about Quick-Stitch Thomas. Not because of how fast he could draw, but because of how he thought 3 moves ahead. He begins laying out his strategy, each detail precise as a master craftsman's cuts. The tunnels provide access to key points throughout town, behind the bank, beneath the hotel, even under the street itself. Years of careful preparation, disguised as simple cobbler's work, have created a web of options that Harrison's men know nothing about. Get word to your deputies, Thomas instructs. When the shooting starts, they need to focus on evacuation, getting people off the streets and away from windows. The shooting? But Harrison said, Harrison's going to kill those hostages no matter what I do. Men like him always do. The only question is how many people they take with them. Thomas checks his guns one final time. But he's made 3 crucial mistakes. What mistakes? First, he thinks he's dealing with a legend, a man who relies on speed and reputation. He's not prepared for someone who's spent 15 years learning patience. Thomas moves to the trap door, his movements fluid and precise. Second, he's gathered all his men in one place, thinking it makes him stronger. Instead, he's put everyone I need to deal with in easy reach. And the third mistake, Thomas's eyes are cold as he begins his descent into the tunnels. He threatened my town. The afternoon sun continues its arc across the sky as Thomas Ward disappears into the darkness beneath Redemption Springs. Above ground, Harrison and his men maintain their siege, believing they've trapped a legend in a corner. They don't realize that some legends don't need to be fast or flashy. Some legends work best in the shadows, methodically and precisely, like a craftsman at his bench. And in 48 minutes, the Black River Gang will learn why the old stories about Quick-Stitch Thomas always ended the same way. With justice. Served, measured out as carefully as leather being cut to pattern, each piece fitting perfectly into its intended design. In the tunnels beneath Redemption Springs, Thomas moves with the sure-footed confidence of a man walking familiar paths. The passages are narrow but well-maintained. Their timber supports solid and true. Every 20 paces, small brass markers catch the light from his hooded lantern, subtle navigation aids that look like old mining claim markers to the untrained eye. Sheriff Mills follows close behind, his footsteps less certain in the darkness. How long have you been preparing for this? Started the day I arrived, Thomas replies softly, pausing at an intersection to check his bearings. Found the old mining. Surveys in the town records. Most folks thought these tunnels were worthless after the silver played out, didn't realize their real value. As escape routes? As options. Thomas takes the left passage, ducking slightly to avoid a low beam. In my old line of work, I learned that fights aren't won at the moment. They won in the preparation. They reach a vertical shaft with iron rungs set into the wall. Thomas extinguishes the lantern and begins to climb. This leads up into the bank's old storage cellar. Hasn't been used in years. They sealed it off during renovations. But the floor above is the bank vault, Mills finishes, understanding dawn. Right under, the hostages. Harrison thinks he's in control because he holds the high ground. Thomas's voice carries a hint of grim satisfaction. He hasn't considered what's beneath his feet. They emerge into a dusty cellar, its existence hidden by old packing crates and years of neglect. Through the ceiling, they can hear movement above. Boots on floorboards, muffled voices, the occasional sob from a hostage. Thomas retrieves several small packages from his coat, the same ones he'd prepared in his shop. Black powder charges, he explains, seeing Mills's questioning look. Not enough to cause serious harm, but placed correctly. Distractions? Components. Thomas begins placing the charges with surgical precision. Like any craft, this is about understanding how pieces work together. The powder creates smoke and confusion. The tunnels provide movement. The gang's own positions become their weakness. He checks his pocket watch. 32 minutes until Harrison's deadline. Time enough to set the rest of the charges. I need you to deliver messages to your deputies. The sheriff nods, committing Thomas's instructions to memory. Each deputy will have a specific role, coordinated with Thomas's larger strategy. They're not just planning a rescue, they're orchestrating a complex sequence of events, each action building on the ones before it. As Mills turns to leave, Thomas adds one final instruction. When you hear the first explosion, have your men start evacuating the west side of town. The gang will be focused on the bank. They won't notice people slipping away if it's done quietly. And the hostages will be out before the second charge detonates. Thomas's voice carries absolute certainty. Harrison thinks he's dealing with a gunfighter. He's not prepared for a craftsman's approach to problem-solving. Alone in the cellar, Thomas continues his preparations. Each charge is placed with the same precision he brings to his leatherwork, creating a carefully orchestrated sequence that will unfold like a well-made boot, taking shape on his bench. Through the floorboards, he can hear Harrison growing increasingly agitated. The gang leader's voice carries an edge of desperation now, his threats becoming more elaborate, more violent. He's realizing that his attempt to draw out the legendary quick stitch, Thomas isn't working as planned. 20 minutes, old man, Harrison shouts. Then Mrs. Turner starts losing fingers. Maybe we'll stitch her up after. See if you're still as quick with the needle as the stories say. Thomas allows himself a small smile as he sets the final charge. Harrison's taunts are revealing more than he realizes, showing his fear, his uncertainty, his growing awareness that something isn't right. The gang leader expected a direct confrontation, a test of speed and nerve. Instead, he's facing an opponent he can't see, can't predict, can't understand. In the shadows of the cellar, Thomas Ward makes his final preparations. His guns are checked one last time, each movement practiced and sure, but they're not his primary tools for this fight. Like any master craftsman, he knows that the right tool for each job isn't always the most obvious one. The afternoon sun continues its descent, sending shadows creeping across Redemption Springs. In 15 minutes, those shadows will reach the bank's front window, part of the natural pattern Thomas has observed and measured over 15 years of patient watching. When they do, the first charge will detonate, beginning a sequence as precisely timed as the stitches in a fine pair of boots. Because Harrison and his gang have made the oldest mistake in the book. They've confused patience for weakness, precision for hesitation. They're about to learn that some men don't rely on speed or strength to win their battles. Some men win by understanding that every problem, every conflict, every situation is like a piece of leather waiting to be worked. You study it carefully, measure twice, plan your cuts, and then execute with unwavering precision. And if you've done your preparation right, each piece comes together exactly as designed. Thomas checks his watch one final time. 10 minutes until Harrison's deadline. Above him, the gang leader's threats have taken on a manic edge, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain control of a situation that's already slipping through his fingers. Last chance, legend. Show yourself. Now, or their blood's on your hands. In the cellar's darkness, Thomas Ward allows himself one final moment of reflection. For 15 years, he's maintained his cover, built his new life, protected his town through subtlety and misdirection. Now that cover is blown, but it doesn't matter anymore, because the skills that made him a legend haven't faded. They've been refined, honed by years of craftsman's work into something even more dangerous. The Black River Gang came looking for Quick-Stitch Thomas, the fastest gun in the West. Instead, they're about to face something far more lethal, a man who's learned that true mastery isn't about speed or power, but about understanding how all the pieces fit together. And in exactly 8 minutes, those pieces will begin falling into place with the inevitability of a well-made plan coming to fruition. The first charge detonates precisely as the bank's shadow touches the hitching post across the street. The explosion isn't large, but in the confined space beneath the bank's floor, it creates a thunderous boom that shakes the entire building. Smoke billows from every crack and crevice, filling the bank with dense, disorienting clouds. Harrison's men react exactly as Thomas predicted, with confusion and panic. Their shots ring out wildly, firing at shadows and smoke, while voices shout contradictory orders. Through the chaos, Thomas moves like a ghost, emerging from a hidden panel behind the teller's cage that hasn't been opened in decades. What the hell was that? Harrison's voice carries a note of hysteria. Someone get down there, and the second charge cuts him off, this one detonating near the bank's rear entrance. More smoke, more confusion. In the chaos, none of the gang members notice the floor panel sliding open beside the hostages, or the way Mary Turner and the others are being quietly guided to safety through the passage below. "Boss!" One of Harrison's men stumbles through the smoke. "Wilson and Parker ain't responding. Posts 3 and 4 are empty." Empty? Harrison spins around, trying to pierce the smoke with desperate eyes. How can they be? The third charge interrupts him, but this one's different. Instead of smoke, it releases a fine powder into the air. The same powder Thomas uses to treat leather, rendered into a cloud that stings eyes and burns throats. Gang members begin coughing, their eyes watering as they struggle to maintain their positions. "Find him," Harrison shouts between coughs. "He has to be here somewhere. The famous Quick-Stitch Thomas wouldn't just..." Famous? Thomas's voice seems to come from everywhere and nowhere in the smoke-filled bank. You keep using that word. Keep talking about legends and reputations. A shape moves through the smoke, there and gone before anyone can draw a bead on it. But you never asked yourself the important question. "Show yourself, damn you!" Harrison fires wildly into the smoke. The question isn't about fame or reputation. Another movement, another glimpse that draws panicked shots from the gang. It's about why a man would spend 15 years maintaining his skills in secret. Why would he practice every day? Not for show, but for precision. 2 more gang members go down, disarmed and disabled so quickly and quietly that their companions don't even notice through the smoke. Harrison spins in place, his nickel-plated guns glinting as he tries to track the voice. Because a real craftsman, Thomas continues, his words punctuated by the soft sounds of men being systematically neutralized, understands that true mastery isn't about being the fastest or the most famous. It's about doing the job right, about understanding your materials, about patience. The smoke begins to thin, revealing the results of Thomas's work. 6 gang members lie groaning on the floor, their weapons expertly disabled, their limbs bound with leather straps cut to precise lengths. Each one has been subdued with surgical precision. No wasted movement, no unnecessary force. Harrison finds himself alone in the center of the bank, his remaining men either taken down or fled. The hostages are gone, spirited away through roots he never knew existed, and through the clearing air, a figure approaches with measured steps. Thomas Ward moves with the same careful precision he brings to his craftsmanship. His guns remain holstered. He hasn't drawn them once during the entire encounter. Instead, his hands carry the tools of his trade. Lengths of leather, a cobbler's hammer, implements that seem harmless until you understand how skillfully they can be used. "You want to know why they called me Quick-Stitch?" Thomas asks conversationally, still advancing. It wasn't about gun speed, it was about efficiency, about knowing exactly where to place each stitch, each strike, each movement to achieve the... Desired result. Harrison raises his revolvers, but his hands are shaking. "Stay back, I'll kill you where you stand." "No!" Thomas's voice carries absolute certainty. "You won't." The gang leader's fingers tighten on both triggers, but nothing happens. His guns don't fire, don't even click. With growing horror, he realizes the weapons have been subtly sabotaged, their firing mechanisms disabled by expert hands during moments when the smoke was thickest. "A craftsman understands his tools," Thomas explains, still moving forward with that same measured pace. "Guns are just tools, Mr. Harrison, like hammers or awls or leather knives. The secret isn't in having the fanciest ones, it's in knowing how they work, how they can be maintained or disabled." Harrison throws his useless guns aside and draws a knife. "I don't need fancy tools to kill you, old man." "That's where you're wrong." Thomas's movement is too fast to follow. The knife goes spinning away, and Harrison finds himself on his knees, his arm twisted in a grip that feels like steel cables. You need much more than tools. You need understanding. Patience, precision. He applies slightly more pressure and Harrison gasps in pain. "Like right now, I'm holding you in a way that puts pressure on 3 specific nerve points. I can cause unconsciousness, extreme pain, or permanent damage, all with the same grip, just applied differently. It's like working leather, knowing exactly how much pressure to use, where to apply it, when to ease off." "Please," Harrison whimpers, his bravado completely gone. "I surrender. I'll face trial, do time, anything." "Trial?" Thomas's voice carries a note of grim amusement. "Oh, you misunderstand. I'm not arresting you. I'm teaching you something about craftsmanship." His grip shifts slightly, and Harrison's world explodes in pain. Lesson 1. Precision matters. I've just applied pressure to a nerve cluster that will leave your right arm useless for exactly 6 weeks. Long enough for justice to be served, but not permanent damage. Another subtle movement, another cry of pain. Lesson 2. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. While you were busy making threats and shooting innocent people, I was methodically dismantling your entire operation. Your men are captured or fled, your weapons are useless, and evidence of all your crimes is already in the hands of federal authorities. Sheriff Mills enters the bank, followed by his deputies. They move efficiently, securing the captured gang members, their actions coordinated with Thomas's plan. And Lesson 3, Thomas concludes, allowing the lawman to take custody of Harrison. The best craftsmen don't need to brag about their work. They let the results speak for themselves. As the gang leader is led away in chains, Thomas begins methodically checking each of his tools, cleaning and returning them to their proper places with the same care he shows in his shop. The bank's interior bears witness to his precision. Despite the chaos and combat, there's minimal damage to the structure or furnishings. Even the leather straps used to bind the gang members are cut to exact lengths, their edges perfectly finished. Outside, the town is emerging from hiding, drawn by word that the threat has been eliminated. They gather in the street, watching as the Black River gang is loaded into prison wagons. Their faces show a mixture of awe and understanding as they observe Thomas Ward calmly returning to his shop, his movements as measured and precise as always. Because now they understand what they've had in their midst all these years. Not just a legend in hiding, but a craftsman who applied his skills to justice with the same patience and precision he brought to leatherwork. A man who proved that true mastery isn't about speed or reputation, but about understanding your craft in all its forms. The sun begins to set over Redemption Springs, painting the town in shades of victory and vindication. In his shop, Thomas Ward returns to the boot he was mending when all this began, his stitches as perfect as ever. To anyone passing by, he's just a skilled craftsman finishing his day's work. They don't need to know that each stitch also serves as a count of breaths, until Harrison and his men are safely locked away. They don't need to understand that every movement of his tools is also a calculation of angles and forces that could be applied in combat. Because Thomas Ward has learned that the greatest victories aren't won with speed or strength, but with patience, precision, and the quiet confidence of a master craftsman who knows his trade in all its forms. As the evening settles over Redemption Springs, the aftermath of the confrontation brings new revelations. Deputy Marshal Hanson arrives with a contingent of federal officers, having ridden hard after receiving Sheriff Mills's telegraph. They find the town already returning to order, with Thomas supervising the secure transportation of the captured gang members. 15 years, Hanson says, watching Thomas check the restraints on Harrison's wrists. 15 years, and not once did you let on, even to me. Thomas finishes his inspection before responding. Some things are better left unsaid, Marshal. You know that better than most. Hanson nods slowly, like why the greatest manhunter in the territory suddenly disappeared, or why certain dangerous men had a habit of avoiding this town, even when they didn't know exactly why. Reputation is a curious thing, Thomas observes, adjusting a strap with practiced care. Sometimes the ones you don't see coming are the most effective. The Marshal studies the captured gang members, noting the precision of their bonds, the careful way each one has been restrained to prevent escape while avoiding unnecessary discomfort. Your work hasn't gotten sloppy, I'll say that much. A craftsman never stops practicing. Thomas steps back, satisfied with his inspection, even when the materials change. Inside the bank, federal agents are documenting the scene. They're particularly interested in the complex network of charges and mechanisms Thomas had rigged throughout the building, all designed to create maximum disruption with minimal damage. It's like a clock, one agent remarks, examining the timing devices. Every piece synchronized, every reaction calculated. Never seen anything like it. That's because you're thinking like a lawman, Hanson responds. Start thinking like a craftsman. Like someone who understands that every problem is just a matter of finding the right technique, the right pressure points, the right sequence of actions. Mary Turner approaches Thomas as the last wagon is being loaded. Her arm is bandaged where Harrison shot her, but her eyes are clear and determined. They said you never fired a shot, that you took them all down with just tools, common things. Nothing common about tools, Mrs. Turner, Thomas replies gently. It's all in how you use them. He reaches into his vest and produces a small leather pouch. This is for Timothy. Your boy always wanted to learn the trade. She opens the pouch with trembling hands to find a set of perfectly maintained leatherworking tools, the same ones Timothy used to admire when he visited Thomas's shop. I don't understand it. How did you know? How did you plan for everything? Wasn't planning exactly. Thomas watches as Harrison's wagon begins its journey to the territorial prison. Just understanding patterns, like leather grain, every situation has its natural lines of force. Learn to read them, and the rest is just a matter of technique. The town council convenes an emergency meeting as night falls, gathering in Judge Wilson's chambers. They've realized that their quiet cobbler hasn't just saved the town. He's been protecting it all along, using his skills in ways they're only beginning to understand. The tunnel system, Mayor Henderson says, spreading out the old mining. Maps. You've been maintaining it all these years, not just as escape routes, but as a way to monitor the town's security. Thomas nods. Every leather shop needs proper ventilation. The old air shafts made perfect observation posts. And the way you positioned your shop, Sheriff Mills adds, between the saloon and the undertaker's. Perfect spot to keep watch on. Both the living and the dead, so to speak. Location matters in any business, Thomas responds mildly, just like tool placement or stitch spacing. Judge Wilson leans forward, his eyes keen. The question is, what happens now? Your cover's blown. Every outlaw in the territory will know Quick Stitch Thomas isn't just a legend anymore. Good. Thomas's voice carries quiet certainty. Let them know. Let them understand that some legends don't fade. They just find different ways to work. He moves to the window, looking out over the town he's protected for 15 years. Craftsman doesn't stop working just because people know his methods. If anything, it makes the work more precise, more focused. You're staying then? The mayor asks. Town needs a cobbler, Thomas says simply, and some jobs require more than one kind of skill. Later that night in his shop, Thomas returns to his workbench. The boot he'd been mending when all this started sits waiting, the leather patient, under his hands. Each stitch he places carries the same precision he used to take down Harrison's gang, the same attention to detail, the same understanding of pressure and technique, because that's what the Black River gang never understood. They thought they were dealing with a legend, a man who relied on speed and reputation. Instead, they faced something far more dangerous, a craftsman who had turned violence into an art form, who had learned that the principles of good leatherwork, patience, precision, understanding of materials, applied equally well to combat. He works, Thomas reflects on the day's events. The town is changing, evolving beyond its need for secrecy. But some things remain constant: the importance of craft, the value of patience, the understanding that true mastery shows itself not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet precision of work well done. The last stitch falls into place just as midnight approaches. Thomas holds up the finished boot, examining it in the lamplight. Every seam is perfect, every repair invisible to the untrained eye. Just like his takedown of the Black River gang. No wasted motion, no unnecessary force, just the careful application of skill and knowledge. Because in the end, that's what makes a true craftsman. Not the tools they use or the reputation they carry, but the understanding that every task, whether mending leather or delivering justice, deserves the same dedication to precision and excellence. Dawn breaks. Over Redemption Springs, with unfamiliar sounds. Hammers repairing the bank's damaged woodwork, horses bringing in supplies, telegraph keys clicking urgently as news of the Black River gang's defeat spreads across the territory. But beneath these sounds of recovery runs an undercurrent of change, as if the town itself is adjusting to its new reality. In his shop, Thomas Ward works with his usual methodical precision, but now there's a steady stream of visitors. Some come with legitimate repairs, others simply to observe. They watch how he handles his tools, seeing them with new understanding. The leather knife that can slice through the toughest hide with surgical accuracy. The awl that can pierce oak-tanned leather, or disable a man's arm with a single precise strike. Never thought I'd see work like that again, a gravelly voice announces from the doorway. Marcus Kane, retired cavalry scout, leans on his cane as he studies Thomas's technique. Saw something similar once down Mexico way. Man took apart a whole gang of bandits using nothing but a farrier's kit. Thomas continues his work, neither confirming nor denying. But Kane presses on, his eyes sharp despite his age. Funny thing was, he did it quite like. No guns, no fuss, just precision. They called him El Artesano, the craftsman. Interesting story, Thomas responds mildly, his hands never pausing in their work. Ain't it, though? Kane's voice drops lower, especially since right after that quick-stitch Thomas appeared in the territories. Same technique, different tools. He taps his cane thoughtfully. Always wondered how a lawman got so good at close work. Now I know, he learned it south of the border. Before Thomas can respond, more visitors arrive. Sarah Miller leads a group of women from the town council, their expressions determined. Mr. Ward, she announces, we need to discuss security arrangements for the mining payroll deliveries. Since yesterday's events proved our current system inadequate. I'm just a cobbler, Mrs. Miller. Thomas interrupts gently, but she holds up a hand. No, Mr. Ward. You're a craftsman, and this town needs your craft, all aspects of it. She places a document on his workbench. The council has voted. We're officially retaining your services, not just for leatherwork, but for security consultation. Proper pay, proper authority. Thomas studies the document without touching it. That would change things. Things have already changed, Sarah responds firmly. Yesterday proved that. Question is, are you willing to help us change in the right direction? Before he can answer, commotion erupts outside. A rider is approaching at full gallop, kicking up dust as he races down the main street. Thomas recognizes him as one of Marshal Hanson's men, but something's wrong about his approach. Too rushed, too panicked for a simple message delivery. The rider barely manages to rein in before the shop. Thomas! The wagons! Harrison's! Men, ambush. Thomas is already moving, his actions swift but unhurried. When, 20 minutes ago, Broken Ridge crossing, 12 men hit the prison wagons, Harrison's cousin leading them. The messenger gulps air. They're headed this way, meaning to finish what Harrison started. The townspeople in the shop begin to panic, but Thomas's calm voice cuts through their fear. Mrs. Miller, implement the evacuation plan we discussed. Mr. Kane, I believe you still remember cavalry signals. When the old scout nods, Thomas continues. Good. Get to the church tower. Signal patterns we worked out last night. His hands never stop working as he gives orders, finishing the boot he's been repairing with the same care he'd use on any normal day. Only when the last stitch is tied does he set aside his tools. Each one return to its precise place and reach for a different set of implements. They're coming here, someone whispers, to our town, for revenge. No, Thomas corrects quietly, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. They're coming here because they don't understand what happened yesterday. They think it was about speed, about fighting. They haven't learned what their cousin did, that this isn't about combat at all. He moves to a cabinet that no one had ever paid much attention to before, opening it to reveal an array of specialized tools. Each one has been maintained with the same precision he brings to his cobbler's implements, but these serve a very different purpose. You see, he continues, selecting items with careful deliberation. Yesterday wasn't about defeating the Black River Gang. It was about demonstrating a principle. About showing proper preparation, proper technique, proper understanding of your materials. He tests the edge of what appears to be a leather knife, but clearly isn't. These matter more than numbers or firepower. Sarah Miller watches him work, understanding dawning in her eyes. You knew they'd try this. You were counting on it. A craftsman anticipates problems, Thomas acknowledges, plans for them. Like leather that needs special treatment, some situations require multiple steps to resolve properly. He turns to address the gathered townspeople. Yesterday, we dealt with Harrison and his immediate men. But his organization is larger. Family members, allies, dependencies. Like a disease, you can't just treat the symptoms. You have to cure the underlying cause. And Harrison's cousin, Kane asks from the doorway. He's the underlying cause? No. Thomas's smile is slight but certain. He's the tool I need to finish this job properly. Him and his 12 men riding hard for revenge, not thinking clearly. He checks his pocket watch. Riding right into a craftsman's workshop. Because that's what Redemption Springs has become. Though Harrison's cousin doesn't know it yet. Every street, every building, every shadow has been prepared over the past night, turning the entire town into one elaborate workbench with Thomas. Ward as the master craftsman ready to demonstrate his art. The sun climbs higher as Thomas completes his preparations. Unlike yesterday's precision takedown inside the bank, this will be a different kind of demonstration. Because sometimes a craftsman needs to make a public statement, needs to show his work in a way that sends a message far beyond the immediate audience. Sarah Miller seems to read his thoughts. You're going to make an example of them. No, Mrs. Miller. Thomas checks the position of the sun, calculating angles and timing just as he would when planning complex leatherwork. I'm going to make a masterpiece, something that will teach everyone in the territory why certain lines shouldn't be crossed. He moves to his window, surveying the street with a craftsman's eye for detail. Every element is in place. Sight lines cleared, escape routes blocked, trap points prepared. All waiting for the right moment, the right pressure, the right technique to transform them from simple town features into something much more purposeful. Because Thomas Ward understands something that Harrison's cousin and his revenge-seeking men don't. True craftsmanship isn't about the tools you use or the strength you apply. It's about turning your entire environment into your workshop, about seeing the potential in every element, about knowing exactly how to shape events to achieve the desired result. In the distance, dust rises from the East Road, riders approaching. At full gallop, exactly as predicted, Thomas makes one final adjustment to his preparations, his movements as precise as if he were crafting the finest pair of boots. "Time to show them," he says quietly, "why a craftsman's reputation isn't built on a single project, but on consistent, reliable, precise work." The town holds its breath as the riders approach, not yet realizing they're galloping straight into the most elaborate demonstration of craftsmanship the territory has ever seen. Because this time, Thomas Ward isn't just going to stop an attack. He's going to turn it into a lesson that will be remembered for generations. "You're not using the tunnels this time," Sheriff Mills observes, watching Thomas position various items throughout the town square. Each placement is precise, measured to the inch, creating a pattern only the craftsman can see. "Different job, different approach," Thomas responds, checking the angle of a seemingly innocent water trough. "Yesterday was about surgical precision. Today needs to be more instructive." The sheriff studies the preparations, noting how ordinary objects have been subtly altered. A hitching post now sits at a slightly different angle. A stack of feed sacks has been arranged in an unusual pattern. Even the way the morning shadows fall seems somehow deliberate, as if Thomas has calculated the sun's path into his plans. "Like setting up a display," Sarah Miller remarks, understanding dawning in her eyes. "When Pa ran the general store, he'd spend hours arranging things just so, making sure customers would see them in exactly the right way." Thomas nods approvingly. "Presentation matters in any craft, whether you're showing goods or teaching lessons." Cade signals from the church tower. The riders are less than 10 minutes out. Thomas makes one final adjustment to a barrel near the saloon, then steps back to survey his work. To most eyes, the town square looks normal, perhaps a bit tidier than usual. But to a craftsman's eye, it's a masterpiece of preparation. "Your men know their positions?" he asks Mills, "just like you specified, though I still don't understand why you want them so far back, out of firing range." "Because this isn't about gunplay." Thomas begins walking toward his shop, his pace unhurried. "It's about demonstrating principles, about showing why certain natural laws shouldn't be violated." He pauses at his door, turning to address the gathered townspeople. "What you're about to see isn't violence. It's craftsmanship. Every reaction, every movement, every consequence has been measured and prepared. Like working with leather, you have to understand how materials behave under pressure." The dust cloud draws closer, and now they can hear the thunder of hooves. Thomas's voice carries clearly in the morning air. Harrison's cousin is angry, unthinking. He'll lead his men straight down the main street because that's what he thinks power. Looks like direct, forceful, obvious. "And you'll show him differently?" Sarah asks. "I'll show him precision." Thomas steps into his shop but leaves the door open. "I'll show him why craftsmanship always defeats brute force." The riders burst into town like a wave of chaos. 13. Men on lathered horses, guns already drawn, led by a man whose resemblance to Harrison is striking. They charge down the main street exactly as Thomas predicted, focused entirely on their goal of revenge. What happens next seems, to untrained eyes, like a series of accidents. A water trough suddenly shifts when a horse brushes it, causing 3 riders to swerve. Their new path takes them under a precariously balanced load of lumber, which chooses that exact moment to slip. The riders evade the falling wood, only to find themselves tangled in clotheslines that somehow catch the sun at blinding angles. More accidents follow in rapid succession. A barrel tips, spilling oil in a precise pattern. A stack of feed sacks collapses in a way that separates riders from their group. Each incident appears random, but drives the attackers into increasingly disadvantageous positions. Through it all, Thomas Ward stands in his shop doorway, watching with a craftsman's satisfaction. As his preparations play out, every reaction has been calculated, every response anticipated. Like a master leatherworker knowing exactly how his material will behave under specific conditions, Harrison's cousin, separated from his men by the chaos, finally realizes something is wrong. He turns his horse in a tight circle, trying to understand why his simple revenge raid has descended into confusion. That's when he spots Thomas. "You!" he roars, spurring his horse forward. "This is what you're doing." "Of course," Thomas replied calmly, "though you're not seeing the whole pattern yet." The cousin raises his gun, but his horse suddenly shoos, spooked by a mirror flash that Thomas triggered with a subtle movement. The man keeps his seat but drops his weapon. When he draws his backup gun, he finds the sun directly in his eyes, thanks to Thomas's careful timing and positioning. "You see," Thomas continues in the same conversational tone, "craftsmanship isn't about single actions. It's about understanding how everything connects. Like right now, you're about to discover why I spent an hour adjusting that hitching post." On cue, the cousin's horse backs into the post. The angle and pressure are perfect, not enough to harm the animal, but sufficient to unseat its rider. Harrison's cousin hits the ground in a way that seems accidental, but lands him exactly where Thomas wants him. 13 men, Thomas observes, finally stepping from his doorway. 13 separate pieces, each one now exactly where they need to be, like cutting pattern pieces for a complex project. The cousin tries to stand, but finds himself in a position where any movement works against him. Around the square, his men are in similar predicaments, each one contained by what appears to be circumstance, but is actually careful design. "Yesterday, I showed your cousin why speed and violence aren't the answer," Thomas says, approaching with measured steps. "Today, I'm demonstrating something more fundamental. Why craftsmanship, true craftsmanship, will always overcome brute force." He reaches. The fallen man, who stares up at him with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. How did you do all this?" "The same way I create fine boots," Thomas responds, "by understanding my materials, preparing properly, and executing with precision." He glances around the square, where Sheriff Mills and his deputies are now, moving in to collect the thoroughly demoralized raiders. Every piece cut correctly, every element positioned just so, everything working together to create the desired result. The morning sun has reached its full strength, illuminating the town. Square exactly as Thomas had calculated. In its light, the pattern of his work becomes clear to those who know how to look. How each accident led inevitably to the next. How the entire space had been transformed into an elaborate craftsman's workshop. "Take a message back to whatever's left of your organization," Thomas tells the cousin as deputies lead him away. "Redemption Springs is under the protection of a craftsman, not a gunfighter, not a lawman, a craftsman. Someone who understands that true mastery isn't about force or speed, but about precision, preparation, and perfect execution." The town begins to return to normal, but something has fundamentally changed. They've witnessed not just a victory, but a demonstration of principles that go beyond simple combat. They've seen why Thomas Ward's reputation was never really about being quick with a gun. It was about being precise with every tool, every technique, every element of his craft. As he returns to his shop, Thomas pauses to straighten the hitching. Post one final time, because a true craftsman always leaves his work in perfect order, ready for the next project. And in Redemption Springs, there will always be more work for a man who understands that the principles of fine craftsmanship apply to every aspect of maintaining justice and peace. Evening settles over Redemption Springs, bringing with it an unfamiliar quiet. The townsfolk have retreated to their homes, discussing in hushed voices the day's events and their deeper implications. But in Thomas Ward's shop, a different kind of revelation is taking place. Marshal Hansen sits across from Thomas's workbench, a bottle of rare Mexican brandy between them. The bottle's label is faded, its wax seal cracked with age. "Been saving this," Hansen says quietly, "for when I finally learned the truth about El Artesano." Thomas pauses in cleaning his tools, a slight smile touching his lips. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." 1858, Hansen continues, pouring 2 measures. "A master craftsman in Mexico City takes an apprentice, a young American who showed unusual promise, not just in leatherwork, but in understanding the deeper principles behind it." He slides 1 glass toward Thomas. "That apprentice disappeared 2 years later after his master was killed by bandits. And shortly after that, stories began circulating about a mysterious figure who hunted those same bandits down." "Stories often grow in the telling," Thomas observes, but accepts the drink. "These ones grew very specific." Hansen leans forward. "About a man who could defeat entire gangs without firing a shot, who used a craftsman's tools and principles to deliver justice. The locals called him El Artesano, the craftsman, but he vanished north of the border, only to be replaced by rumors of a new lawman, one they called Quick-Stitch Thomas." The brandy catches lamplight as Thomas swirls it thoughtfully. "You've done your research. 15 years of it, ever since you disappeared after the Carson Gang incident." Hansen's eyes are keen in the lamplight. "What I couldn't figure out was why you were at the peak of your reputation. Every territory wanted you as their marshal. Then suddenly you vanish, only to resurface as a simple cobbler in a small town." Thomas sets his glass down carefully, precisely aligned with the edge of his workbench. "Have you ever watched a master craftsman work leather, Marshal? Not just the obvious parts, the cutting and stitching, but the preparation, the way they choose their materials, treat them, understand their nature?" Hansen nods slowly. "My master in Mexico City, Eduardo Ramirez, taught me that everything in life follows the same principles. To master leather, he'd say, is to master the understanding of how materials react to treatment, how they can be shaped, strengthened, transformed, not through force, but through knowledge and patience." Thomas stands, moving to the window. Outside, the town is settling into its new reality, forever changed by the past 2 days' events. When the bandits killed him, I was angry, wanted revenge. But even then, I remembered his teachings. Didn't hunt them with guns blazing. Instead, I studied them, learned their patterns, their weaknesses, used the principles of craftsmanship to take them apart piece by piece. And that approach became your trademark, Hansen supplies. The lawman who could disable entire gangs without firing a shot, who used precision and preparation instead of speed and force. It worked, Thomas acknowledges. Too well, maybe. Started believing my own legend. Started forgetting the deeper lessons Eduardo taught me. His voice carries a weight of memory. Until the Carson Gang, Hansen leans forward. That's what I never understood. You took them down just like all the others. What changed? Everything. Thomas returns to his workbench, running a hand along its worn surface. The Carson brothers had hostages, a family they'd kidnapped. I did what I always did, studied, planned, prepared, set my trap perfectly. But I was so focused on the precision of my work, I missed something crucial. What? The human element. One of the hostages, a young girl, panicked, ran at exactly the wrong moment. Everything went wrong. Thomas's hands continue their methodical work, but his eyes are distant. I still stopped the gang, but the girl was hurt in the crossfire. She lived, but he shakes his head. That's when I realized I'd lost sight of what Eduardo really taught me, which was that true craftsmanship isn't about the craftsman. It's about making things better, about creating something that serves a purpose beyond yourself. Thomas picks up a piece of leather, demonstrating as he speaks. When you work leather properly, you're not forcing it to be something it's not. You're helping it become the best version of what it already is. Understanding dawns in Hansen's eyes. So you came here. Redemption Springs needed a cobbler more than it needed another legend, needed someone who could watch, wait, protect, not through force or reputation, but through careful, patient work. Thomas smiled slightly. Eduardo used to say that the best craftsmen are the ones whose work isn't noticed until it's needed. But you didn't stop practicing, Hansen observes, didn't stop preparing. A craftsman never stops learning. Every pair of boots I made, every repair I completed, they were all practice, all preparation, not just for violence, but for a challenge that might come. Thomas returns to his seat, picking up his glass. The town shaped me as much as I shaped it, taught me that true mastery isn't about what you can do, but about knowing when and how to do it. Hansen studies his old friend with new eyes. And now your secret's out. Things can't go back to the way they were. They don't need to. Thomas's voice carries quiet certainty. Redemption Springs has grown beyond needing secrets. What it needs now is understanding of how to maintain what we've built, how to protect it, how to help it become the best version of itself. Marshall nods slowly, comprehension dawning, like working leather. Exactly like working leather. Thomas raises his glass. To Eduardo Ramirez, who taught me that every craft, properly understood, is about making the world a little better than you found it. As they drink the rare brandy, Thomas Ward reflects on how his master's lessons have shaped not just his life, but an entire town. Because Redemption Springs isn't just a place he's protected, it's his masterwork, crafted over 15 years of patient labor. Each citizen shaped by his subtle influence, each interaction carefully maintained, each potential threat transformed into something constructive. The lamp burns low as the two men talk, sharing stories of the past that illuminate the present. Outside, the town sleeps peacefully, unaware that its quiet cobbler hasn't just been making boots all these years. He's been practicing an art far older and deeper than mere leatherwork. Because Thomas Ward understands now what Eduardo tried to teach him so long ago, that true craftsmanship isn't about the items you create or the skills you master. It's about shaping the world itself, one careful stitch at a time, until something beautiful and lasting emerges from your patient work. The first signs of trouble arrive with the morning stage. Among the passengers stepping down into Redemption Springs' dusty street is a man who moves with the careful precision of someone accustomed to measuring risks. His clothes are Eastern cut, expensive, but practical, and his eyes scan the town with professional interest. Thomas Ward, watching from his shop window, recognizes the look. He's seen it before, in men who calculate everything in terms of profit and loss. The stranger's gaze lingers on the bank, on the signs of recent repair, on the spots where Thomas's accidents had so precisely dismantled Harrison's cousins. "Attack James Whitaker," Marshal Hansen says from the doorway, having followed Thomas's line of sight. "Representative of the Western Territories Investment Corporation. Word is, they've been buying up towns all along the proposed railroad route." Thomas continues working on a complex repair, his hands steady as he considers the implications. Interesting timing, isn't it? Hansen moves further into the shop, lowering his voice. Companies have a reputation for acquiring troubled towns cheaply, places where violence or corruption have driven down property values, like towns recently attacked by notorious gangs. Thomas's needle moves with precise strokes, each stitch perfect despite the tension in the air. Exactly. They swoop in, buy everything at panic prices, then sell high once the railroad comes through. Hansen watches Thomas work for a moment. But that's not why I'm here. Got a wire from territory headquarters. The Harrison case has stirred up a hornet's nest. Thomas ties off a stitch before responding. What kind? Seems the Black River Gang was just one piece of a larger operation. Railroad speculators, land fraud, protection rackets, all connected to some very powerful people. People who aren't happy about their plans being disrupted. And now they're sending their own craftsmen to assess the situation, Thomas observes, nodding toward Whitaker, who's now speaking with members of the town council. Man's got a different reputation than Harrison, Hansen warns. Doesn't use violence, he uses contracts, legal threats, economic pressure. Towns that resist his company's offers tend to suffer mysterious accidents. Banks foreclose, businesses fail, supplies get diverted. Thomas sets aside his work, giving the marshal his full attention. How many towns? 7 in the past year. All along the proposed railroad route, all now owned by Western Territories Investment Corporation. Hansen's face is grim. And all after some kind of crisis created a buyer's market. Before they can discuss further, the shop's door chimes. James Whitaker enters, moving with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His smile is practiced, professional, reaching his eyes with calculated precision. "Mr. Ward," he says warmly, "your reputation precedes you. Both of them, actually." Thomas remains seated at his workbench, neither acknowledging nor denying the implied revelation. "Need some boots repaired, Mr. Whitaker?" "Actually, I'm here to discuss a different kind of craftsmanship." Whitaker produces a leather portfolio, its quality immediately apparent to Thomas's expert eye. The craft of progress, of development, of turning frontier towns into modern cities. He spreads documents across the workbench, maps, surveys, projections. "The railroad's coming, Mr. Ward. Within 2 years, Redemption Springs will be a major hub. Property values will soar, but development requires stability, security." His smile turns knowing. "The kind of security a man of your skills could help provide." "I'm just a cobbler," Thomas responds mildly, but Whitaker waves this away. "Please, let's not pretend. What you did with the Black River Gang was masterful, precisely the kind of craftsmanship. My employers appreciate it. They've authorized me to offer you a position, head of security for all our territorial holdings." Hansen stiffens, but Thomas's expression remains unchanged. "Generous offer. Very generous." Whitaker names a figure that would buy every business. "In Redemption Springs twice over, plus a percentage of development profits. All you have to do is relocate to our regional office in Denver, leave this limited venue for your talents." "And if I decline?" Whitaker's smile doesn't waver. "Progress is inevitable, Mr. Ward. Like working leather, development follows natural patterns. Sometimes those patterns require reshaping existing structures." He gestures toward the town square. "Redemption Springs will change. The only question is whether that change benefits its citizens or breaks them." Thomas picks up a piece of leather, examining its grain with careful attention. "Interesting analogy, Mr. Whitaker, but incomplete. You see, a good craftsman understands that leather can't be forced to take shapes it's not ready for. Try to rush the process, and you end up with something weak, flawed, ultimately worthless. Philosophy wasn't part of my offer, Mr. Ward." "No." Thomas sets down the leather, meeting Whitaker's eyes. "Your offer was about control, about replacing one form of corruption with another, better-dressed version, about turning my craft to your purposes instead of the town's needs." Whitaker's smile finally slips, revealing something harder beneath. "Don't make this difficult. My employers have invested considerable resources in their development plans. They're not accustomed to resistance. Neither am I. Thomas's voice carries the same quiet authority he uses when explaining his craft. You studied what happened with Harrison's gang, studied my methods, but you missed the essential point, which is, a true craftsman doesn't serve himself or his employers. He serves his craft, makes things better, not just different. Thomas stands slowly, his movement carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Redemption Springs isn't for sale, Mr. Whitaker. Not its land, not its people, and certainly not its soul. The corporate man's facade cracks further. You're making a serious mistake. My employers have ways of dealing with obstacles. Legal means, financial pressure, accidents that can't be traced. Like the accidents that happened to those other towns? Thomas asks quietly. The ones that convinced them to sell? The mysterious fires, the supply problems, the bank foreclosures. Whitaker takes an involuntary step back, something in Thomas's tone setting off warning signals. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. Redemption Springs is under my protection. Not just from obvious threats like the Black River Gang, but from more subtle dangers, men in expensive suits who think they can reshape a town through fear and manipulation. He moves around the workbench, each step measured and precise. You're right about one thing, Mr. Whitaker. I am a craftsman. And like any good craftsman, I understand materials, their strengths, their breaking points, their natural patterns, including the patterns of men who think they're too clever to be caught. Whitaker attempts to recover his composure. Is that a threat, Mr. Ward? No. It's a professional assessment. Like recognizing flaws in leather before they become visible. Thomas's smile is cold. Your corporation's methods leave traces, records, patterns that a careful observer might find interesting. The kind of patterns that territorial investigators would love to examine. The corporate man's face goes pale. You're bluffing. You couldn't possibly. 15 years, Mr. Whitaker. 15 years of watching, waiting, gathering information. Every trader who passed through, every business that failed mysteriously, every piece of land that changed hands under suspicious circumstances. A craftsman pays attention to details. Thomas returns to his workbench, picking up his tools with practiced ease. So here's my counteroffer. Leave Redemption Springs. Tell your employers to focus their development plans elsewhere. Because if anything happens to this town, any accidents, any mysterious financial problems, any pressure on its citizens, I'll use every piece of evidence I've gathered to destroy your entire operation. The threat hangs in the air. Its weight measured in 15 years of patient observation and precise record-keeping. Whitaker looks between Thomas and Hanson, calculating odds, measuring risks, finally understanding that he's facing something far more dangerous than a simple retired lawman. He's facing a craftsman who's turned his entire town into a workshop, who's spent years preparing for threats both obvious and subtle, who understands that true protection requires more than just skill with weapons or tools. My employers won't be happy. Whitaker manages finally. They'll be less happy if I have to demonstrate my craftsmanship in their organization. Thomas responds calmly. Some things, once unmade, can't be put back together. The corporate man retreats, his smooth confidence shattered. But Thomas knows this isn't the end. It's merely the beginning of a different kind of challenge. Because some threats can't be defeated with precision strikes or careful preparation. Sometimes a craftsman has to reshape the entire landscape and has to work with materials more complex than leather or wood. Sometimes he has to protect not just lives, but the very soul of a community. And as Thomas Ward returns to his work, he begins planning for this new challenge, because a true craftsman never stops learning, never stops preparing, never stops finding new ways to perfect his craft. The telegraph office in Redemption Springs has never been busier. Messages flow in and out like an invisible river, carrying information that Thomas Ward has spent 15 years collecting. Each telegram represents a thread in a complex tapestry of evidence, carefully woven together over years of patient observation. Denver. Office confirms it, Sarah Miller reports, bringing another stack of replies. Western Territories Investment Corporation has connections to every major land scandal in the territory. Tax records, property transfers, mysterious accidents, all documented just like you said. Thomas studies the telegrams with the same attention he'd give to examining leather grain. And the other matter? Judge Wilson's contacts in the territorial capital came through. They've identified 7 more towns targeted for acquisition along the railroad route. She spreads a map across his workbench, each location marked with precise notes in Thomas's careful hand. The pattern's exactly what you predicted. Patterns are everything, Thomas responds, tracing lines between the marked towns. In leather work, you learn to read the grain, to understand how stress lines connect and influence each other. Same principle applies here. Marshal Hanson enters, bringing more pieces to the puzzle. Federal investigators are interested. Very interesting, especially in those records you've been keeping about supply line disruptions and mysterious property transfers. 15 years of watching, recording, connecting dots. Thomas moves to a cabinet that no one had paid much attention to before. Inside, leather-bound journals fill several shelves, each one meticulously organized and cross-referenced. Every trader who mentioned problems with deliveries, every business that failed under suspicious circumstances, every piece of land that changed hands at unusual prices. The marshal examines one of the journals with growing amazement. You weren't just protecting the town from obvious threats. You were gathering evidence against whoever was behind them. A craftsman prepares his materials before beginning work, Thomas explains, selecting specific volumes. Sometimes that preparation takes years, but when it's done properly, he opens a journal to a precisely marked page. Every piece fits together perfectly. Sarah studies the pattern of evidence with new understanding. That's why you stayed so long in one place. Why do you maintain your cover even after it becomes difficult? You weren't just waiting for threats to appear. I was documenting the whole pattern, Thomas confirms. Individual incidents mean nothing, but when you step back, see how they connect. He gestures to the map, where his markings reveal a clear design of corporate manipulation and corruption. The true picture emerges. The shop's door chimes as Judge Wilson enters, carrying legal documents. The territorial governor is very interested in your evidence, Thomas, particularly the connections between Western Territories investment and certain government officials. Corporate operations like theirs require support from inside the system, Thomas observes, examining the documents with a practiced eye. Like tooling leather, you need the right backing or the work falls apart. They're already trying to discredit you, Hanson warns, painting you as a violent vigilante, using his reputation to interfere with legitimate business. Thomas allows himself a slight smile. Let them. Every attempt they make to discredit me only draws more attention to the evidence. Like working with difficult leather, sometimes you use the material's resistance to achieve your goal. He moves to his workbench, where an unfinished boot sits waiting. As he talks, his hands return to their craft, each stitch precise and purposeful. Western Territories think they understand power. They see it in money, in legal documents, in the ability to pressure people through financial means. And they're wrong, Sarah asks. They're incomplete, Thomas corrects, his needle moving steadily. True power, like true craftsmanship, isn't about force or control. It's about understanding how things work together, how communities support each other, how people unite against threats once they understand them. He holds up the boot, demonstrating as he speaks. See these stitches. Each one is small, seemingly insignificant, but together they create something stronger than the sum of their parts. That's what Whitaker and his employers don't understand about Redemption Springs. Judge Wilson nods slowly. The town's changed, grows stronger through everything it's faced. Exactly. Thomas returns to his work. Harrison's gang thought they could take control through violence. Western territories think they can do it through economic pressure. Both failed to understand that this town isn't just buildings and businesses. It's relationships, connections, people working together. He begins laying out his strategy, each element precisely planned, like the cuts in a complex leather project. First, we expose their pattern of corruption, not just here, but in every town they've targeted. Show how their accidents and financial pressures are coordinated, deliberate. The federal investigators will help with that, Hansen confirms. Second, we demonstrate the strength of community resistance. Every business they pressure, every supplier they try to intimidate, find support from neighboring towns. Their tactics only work when people feel isolated, vulnerable. Sarah's eyes light with understanding. Like when you helped the Chen families. Laundry stay open during hard times, or when you arranged for the miller's store to get supplies through alternative routes. A craftsman supports his community, Thomas acknowledges, helps it become stronger, more resilient. And third, Judge Wilson prompts, third, we show them what real craftsmanship looks like. Thomas's voice carries absolute certainty, not just in stopping their operations, but in building something better, something that serves the community instead of exploiting it. He spreads out plans that have clearly been years in development, proposals for community-owned businesses, cooperative arrangements between towns, systems to protect against economic manipulation. Each element is carefully thought out, precisely designed to strengthen the town's independence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.